Of course, you spend in advertising for purposes of growth, but oftentimes the first step is changing the narrative of your brand.
Hello, and welcome to The Marketing Architects, a research-first podcast dedicated to answering your toughest marketing questions. I'm Elena Jasper. I run the marketing team here at Marketing Architects, and I'm joined by my co-hosts, Angela Voss, the CEO of Marketing Architects, and Rob DeMars, the Chief Product Architect of Misfits and Machines.
Hello.
Hello.
We're back with our thoughts on some recent marketing news, always trying to root our opinions in data, research, and what drives business results. Today, we're talking about a point of view that was brought to the attention of a lot of marketers recently, and that is the general opinion that advertising is on the way out. It's not as effective as it used to be. It's not necessary. Big brands can go without it. Position this however you'd like. It all comes from the same general belief system that the era of advertising is over. I want to talk about this on the show because while this isn't really a new idea, Scott Galloway, who's a marketing professor at NYU and now a well-known business influencer, joined Jon Evans recently on his show Uncensored CMO and said this. To be specific, he said, "What do the companies that have added over $100 billion in value over the last decade have in common? They don't advertise." While this interview went viral in the marketing community recently, especially on LinkedIn, I've heard Galloway test out this opinion on his own show for quite a while. He'll mention brands like Google, Amazon, Netflix, Facebook, and Tesla as examples of why advertising doesn't work the way it used to. And he'll say this to set up the fact that what you need today really is a great product to grow. You don't need advertising anymore. Now, there's been plenty of piling on about these comments online already, and by the time this episode drops, it'll be older news. So I want to try to stick to the mission of this podcast, which is to cover marketing news and trends with a research-first approach. And I think there's an interesting conversation and debate here underneath the more sort of inflammatory statements that Galloway has made. So I know we're all passionate about this topic, but let's play nice. I could share first my initial reaction to hearing this, because he's said it before on his show. I like his podcast a lot. And when I first heard it, I felt like I was taking crazy pills because I was thinking, wait a second, we look at ad spend all the time, especially me on my team, because we're constantly looking at brands we could potentially work with. I'm like, am I losing my mind? These are huge advertisers. I've seen them in the Super Bowl. I've seen them all advertising. We did a podcast episode last year on Tesla and how they're turning on advertising. So I just started to think, am I taking crazy pills here, or is this wrong? Is this right? And I felt not bad, but I could see Jon Evans kind of wanting to jump out of his chair and correct him. It's probably really hard. You're interviewing Scott Galloway, you're face to face, and he's saying these things with such confidence, comes at it with such certainty. And I know that Jon Evans especially has all the data, and it must have been really hard not to just immediately want to start arguing.
It is the Uncensored podcast, though.
Yes, it definitely was uncensored, but not to plug our own show, but I think this is why we're excited about trying to look at marketing through more research, data-driven, because people just throw around stuff like this. And Scott Galloway is a huge public figure, and I think it's damaging for advertising because he has a huge audience on his podcast. He throws around stuff like this. Nobody says anything. And it does add to this general narrative that advertising isn't important, advertising's dying, and I don't think it's particularly helpful and sort of funny coming from a marketing professor who built his career and most of his wealth on a brand strategy company. So I don't know, just kind of odd. But Ange, what did you think?
Yeah, I too had a very similar reaction to what you did, Elena. It was, what are you doing? What in a single sentence trying to cancel advertising in general, the whole industry? It just didn't make sense to me, especially given the brands that he was naming. So I was confused. We're very close to advertising, and not everyone that listens to the Uncensored CMO is probably super close to it, but a lot of people probably are. I feel like it's one of those statements that is provocative, and I love provoking thought strings and contrarian thinkers and stuff like that. And so you have a little bit of respect for someone willing to go out there and say something like that and really get people thinking about it. But too, it just feels a bit reckless. I agree.
I really like Scott, and I know he really likes our podcast. He's been listening to it for years, which is amazing since we've only been on it for a year. Shout out to the dog. All that being said, the guy likes to pop off. That's his brand, right? He's got his own brand he's managing right now. And I am sure that the Vox Media sales department, which is responsible for selling ads on Prof G and the Pivot podcast, probably choked on his headline. Definitely, I think what he did do a good job at was bringing back the conversation to where are we at with advertising, and is it dead or is it not? And whether you agree with him or you don't agree with him, the headline sure shook people up and started that conversation going again. So give him credit for that.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the hard part about when you say data points that are just wrong is it takes away from his actual point, which I don't think is a bad point. How much product matters today, how now things can spread more through virality and word of mouth. Like, you can't get away with having a really bad product like you used to be able to, because now everything's so transparent. There's online reviews. So I don't even disagree too much with his underlying message, but his just statement about advertising in general being so wrong. He also has a book coming out. That's why he's been doing this podcast tour. So I think maybe he's trying to get something going. He's a very smart person. So I'm sure he probably doesn't mind too much the attention that he's gotten. I should point out, too, that he did have a Times Square billboard of his book that went live the day after this podcast dropped.
Oh, that's fantastic.
It's a little interesting. So part of him still believes.
He got it for free. It was all, he didn't pay for it.
Yeah.
It's all part of a marketing plan.
Yes. Like I said earlier, I do want to use this as an opportunity to discuss advertising effectiveness in general and maybe bring some data and research into this debate. So his general question really is advertising still as powerful as it once was? And I'm going to kick us off by addressing his main claim that the brands he listed as examples don't advertise. And we just mentioned this before, that we heard that and we were like, wait, I'm pretty sure that these brands spend a lot on advertising. And I was going to pull this data myself when I first heard the interview, but James Herman actually beat me to it, and he shared a great image on LinkedIn that shows the valuation of Google, Amazon, Netflix, Facebook, and Tesla 10 years ago compared to 2023. And that shows that all these companies have added $100 billion in value over the past decade, which is part one of what Galloway said. So what about their advertising? Was it zero? Well, Tesla was the closest to zero, but they announced last year that they've turned on their advertising. They haven't turned it off. And from what I can find using our own ad spend tools, they've spent about $11 million in advertising in the past 12 months, which is not a lot, but Tesla is really the exception here, not the rule. Netflix spent $1.5 billion on advertising in 2022, so 2023 numbers are probably around that. Facebook spent $2 billion last year. Google spent $8.7 billion, and Amazon, typically one of the largest, if not the largest advertiser in the US, spent $20.3 billion on advertising last year. So just Galloway's claim alone that these brands are not spending on advertising is incorrect. But if we put that aside, maybe this ad spend isn't doing anything for these brands. Maybe they're truly propelled by product, and if they turned off that advertising tomorrow and invested those funds in product development, it might be business as usual. So, Ange, we have some experience with this type of hypothetical scenario. We've worked with clients who do dark advertising tests where they turn off spend for a period of time and see what happens. What do our clients typically experience when they do that?
I think this is one of the reasons why brands are maybe hesitant to get into television, because they assume, and for some brands, it would be very hard to see. What is the decay, the drop off? Is there none? Is there some as you turn advertising off? But given our history, where we come from, growing up in performance marketing, our belief around multiple measurement models, we would be fired by our clients if we couldn't show to them that when we turn television off, that there isn't a negative performance impact to their business. And it very much depends upon the industry you play in, how much you're spending on television, how long have you been on television, current trajectory of the business, etc. But in general, there is a slow decay throughout the funnel that takes place over weeks to months, not months to years. And it's also not an overnight drop off a cliff. Brand does matter. And I think that goes against, of course, what he was saying. We're not all in market at the exact same time for a product or service. And so there is an immediate impact that you can see, but it doesn't all happen immediately. And so usually top of funnel metrics like web sessions and search take a hit early on, and then the impact makes its way down the funnel into leads, orders, revenue. And we look at this on multiple levels. We look at macro modeling. We look at it through on-site surveys. We use more advanced econometric, MMM type models, again, to try to triangulate, in this case, the negative impact that is seen by turning advertising off.
Clearly, advertising works. At least in our experience, it works. So why does it work? I want to talk about kind of the core of his argument. Why do even massive brands like Amazon, Netflix, even now Tesla, why do they still need to advertise?
I mean, I think there's a lot of reasons specific to each brand how advertising positively impacts growth or profit, et cetera. But at the core of it, I think a big piece is just your system one versus system two thinking, right? Back to Daniel Kahneman. System one is like your brain's fast, intuitive, subconscious mode of thinking, how we make decisions on a day in, day out basis. And so advertising really acts as a means for consumers build these mental shortcuts that really simplify how we make decisions on a day in and day out basis. I mean, if you think about if you literally had to go into system two mode every single time you did something in life, like how crazy that might be. And advertising is a conduit to us not having to do that. Priming and repetition, right? Repeated exposure to a message primes a consumer to associate certain attributes with a brand. I'll take Nike, for example. Their Just Do It slogan, their swoosh logo, they're associating with athleticism, with motivation. Again, that helps in system one thinking. Even things like logos, jingles, packaging, just sort of instantly activate that system one thinking. We think about like McDonald's Golden Arches or Intel's jingle. They just create that immediate brand recognition and create that mental availability for consumers to not have to think so hard when they go into decision-making mode. And then I think too, getting beyond just customer acquisition and the ability to be top of mind to a consumer subconsciously, again, I think even for cost-conscious consumers, advertising has been proven over and over to be a driver of profit as consumers are more willing to pay higher prices for brands that are familiar to them. Generally, that brand familiarity is driven by advertising. Now, that's not to say, if Rob tells me, oh my gosh, you gotta check this thing out, which he does incessantly, by the way. He's like a constant pusher of products.
Got another one for you later.
Okay. That has value. Like Rob's opinion on something has value. I trust him. And so that too, I might not be as cost conscious if he gives me a recommendation as compared to that product's competitor that I know nothing about. I might be more cost conscious. So again, it's these absolutes where we get in trouble.
I agree. This whole conversation can be a bit silly. I mean, at the end of the day, forget about the word advertising. All right, let's just take that word out of our nomenclature for a minute. Is it important for a brand to be known? If you're a brand that is driving all the growth and attention you need, and you're hitting all your goals without spending a dime, good for you. That's amazing. But not everyone can be a disruptive technology, right? Tesla got a lot of headlines, both because they were a new category and also they have a crazily interesting CEO, however you want to look at him, right? He grabs the headlines himself. Most of us live in a world of consumer product goods and services where you're really trying to differentiate yourself. And it's a crowded, competitive world. I think that both advertising in terms of how we advertise will always be changing, right? It'll always evolve. A few years ago, nobody heard of TikTok. A few years from now, there'll be another way for brands to dialogue with their consumers. It'll always be changing, but brands will always need to be dialoguing or they'll be dying. And most of us, we need to pay in order to be heard. It's just the physics of the marketplace.
That's a great point, Rob, about how it'd be great if you operated in a category where you can grow without advertising. Like, yeah, that'd be perfect if you don't have to spend any money on advertising. But even if you have the best product, I think about a category like search, where I've heard that DuckDuckGo has a superior product to Google. Okay, that's what I've heard. But that's not enough. Like, you're going up against Google. Like, that's why DuckDuckGo advertises. And there, you could just think of most categories. You're going to need some sort of momentum, even if you have a better product, to get it out there. And also, consumers don't just make totally rational decisions about which product is better and which is worse. Usually we're looking for the easiest way I can think to buy something, to get to something. And that's typically going to be whatever comes to mind first. And you can use advertising to get there. It's a good point, Rob. I know it's a little bit of a silly argument, but it's an argument, though. Like,
it's an argument. Oh, absolutely.
Well, and again, it's like, can you grow without advertising? Yeah, you could. You could. Can you grow as fast? Are you going to be as profitable? I mean, how many people do I talk to a day? I work in marketing and I talk to a ton of people every day. I would say more than the average person. So if I'm an evangelist for all of my favorite products and I tell literally every single person about it, I don't know, maybe 100 people a day? Like, so how fast are you trying to grow? How much scale do you want to have? And if you're trying to be a category leader, it's hard to wrap your mind around how to do that without mass scale advertising on some level. And that could be digital. I'm not going to get into an argument of channels, but how do you get a message in front of people so they know who you are? I think you're probably more likely to do that if you're developing a new category. Those are the spaces where you're disrupting a market, you're an Uber. That type of new product or service innovation really has virality to it. And that is your advertising.
Right.
But it's still needing to spread.
And while it's always about, of course, you spend in advertising for purposes of growth, but oftentimes the first step is changing the narrative of your brand. You might be Dove soap going, we need to really reposition and retell our story. And you're not going to do that through word of mouth.
And you mentioned, I know you don't want to get into the channel debate, but the biggest digital advertising platforms are also some of the biggest traditional advertising companies, cough, Meta, cough. So I'm just saying, this is just my favorite argument. I was so fired up when I saw the podcast. I was like, oh, just let me at it. Because I'm a loser. So we've discussed kind of the high level 10,000 foot view of this argument. I wanted to get into some details and talk about a brand that is known for having a great product, a superior product, but has still used advertising to grow. And if you listened to our podcast before, you probably know that Rob is a big Apple fan. So I thought they'd be the perfect brand to pick as an example. Rob, I was hoping you could walk us through just the history of the impact that advertising has had at Apple. And I know this could be its own episode, so maybe just focus on the highlights. And I'd also like to provide a disclaimer that I picked Apple as this example before their iPad ad. So this might seem like a bad example for the time, but I still think they're worthy of a case study.
I mean, geez, where do you start with Apple? I mean, they are a masterclass in advertising. They're one of the reasons many people like myself were inspired to even go into advertising. Their brand and their product is just symbiotically connected. You started in 1984 with the most famous Super Bowl ad ever produced by director Ridley Scott, the Macintosh 1984 commercial. For all you young folk out there, look it up. You'll be amazed at even the next campaign that comes to mind is the Think Different campaign. And you'd be amazed in both of these scenarios, the products are never actually shown. So you don't see a Mac computer in the 1984 Super Bowl commercial. The Think Different campaign featured all these famous people from Albert Einstein to Bob Dylan, and it really spoke into the ethos of what Apple was all about. But they didn't show any product. And then they did it again with the Get a Mac campaign, where they had Justin Long and John Hodgman being the Mac and the PC. But again, not showing any product, but really speaking into that brand story. But then, of course, where Apple zigs, they'll also zag. And they are also famous for doing commercials that are absolutely delicious to watch, if I might say, but it's only showing the product. But their products are just so gorgeous, all the way back to the iMac campaign, where they would show the colorful blueberry iMac, just tight shots to the iPhone and showing how amazing the iPhone looks. And then the shot from an iPhone campaign, which then showed just how amazing the product worked. I mean, this is a brand that has pulled pretty much every major advertising lever perfectly. until, of course, their last commercial that they just aired that got everybody ticked off. Hey, and I'll defend them. I'm like, come on, given the amazing history that Apple has had and the amount of inspiration they poured into the world through their advertising and creating the greatest products in the world, and then we all get our undies in a bunch over some silly iPad ad where they cram everything into an iPad. Like, come on. I think they can get a hall pass on that one.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's so cool that their most famous ad, when you think of Apple, wasn't a product ad, and they have arguably like the best,
most amazing product.
The most amazing product. Yeah, that must speak for advertising too. That Steve Jobs, who's known as the product guy, he went for a commercial that was more about how you feel and creativity and like a deeper message than just showing product.
I think it was a sign of the times too. When you think about the 80s and the 90s, it was all about hardware. And he really wanted to go contrarian to that and show the spirit of technology. You know, he famously said that the computer is the bicycle for the mind. And it's just like, I think really trying to bring that to life. I mean, the whole idea of a home computer was really brought to us by Apple, right? So how do you connect with people, but on an emotional level? And then when everyone started doing that, well, of course, they zagged again and said, well, let's just show you our product because our product's amazing. And somehow they can make a tabletop product shoot really cool.
Thanks, Rob. Well, some might say that this episode wasn't necessary because it's pretty obvious why advertising works, but I wanted to have it because it was therapeutic for me. I'm glad that we went through this and made the argument. So thank you, Scott Galloway, for giving us an opportunity to get on a soapbox about how amazing advertising is. So to wrap up, I thought it might be fun to share what is each of our favorite stories about how advertising has transformed a company. And Rob, why don't you kick us off?
There's obviously many to choose from, but one that came to mind immediately for me was Old Spice. I mean, talk about a brand that was old and tired. And through their amazing work, we've all seen with the gentleman in the shower and completely transform around him while he's in the shower with his big manly voice. And I think they've just done such a wonderful job in reinventing that brand, and vice versa, because their product has also gained, I think, a lot of new branding elements because of that campaign. They have scents like swagger, which they didn't have prior to that. So I think there's just been a really cool relationship between both the advertising and then the products that it delivers.
I never knew that about Old Spice. I've always known them as a very cool, like the Old Spice you know now. I didn't know that they went through a brand transformation.
Oh, my dad used to wear it. I can still see the bottle sitting on our old countertop. It was a weird one for me because then it becomes hip and cool.
Yeah.
You know?
What's funny is in high school, I know that they mostly target their ads towards men, but in high school, the girls would wear Old Spice. Maybe that was just my high school, but yeah. Yeah, girls wore it too. It was cool to be wearing it as a girl and a boy.
Okay.
Maybe weird.
Not clued in enough to know stuff like that. This one's sort of embarrassing because it just feels so basic to me, but I'm like, is there a better story than a company increasing their market share from 18% to 43% in a decade, growing their annual sales from $877 million to over $9 billion? And that was done by Nike and their Just Do It campaign. Somebody might argue that that wasn't the Just Do It campaign. That was Michael Jordan. That was advertising. Like that.
Exactly. Either way you look at it, it was
put the shoes on his feet or put an ad on television. It's the same thing. It's mass communication out to the shoes aren't that much better. I mean, they're fine. You know.
Mine is a little bit personal, but also I think a great brand. One of my favorite brands is Volvo, which I'd guarantee when I say Volvo, you probably think of safety because that's what they're known for. And I think they're a great example of how a great product combined with effective advertising will take off, because they made safety a core part of their brand back in the 50s and 60s. And back then, car safety wasn't as big of a concern as it is today. They actually created the 3-point seatbelt, which is now standard safety feature, obviously, in all of our cars. And they could have just kept this to themselves and patented it, but they opened it up so that other car manufacturers could use it. And way back in the 50s and 60s, they started using advertising, promoting their safety features. One of my favorite print ads is a picture of an old Volvo, and it's all crunched up, like it got in a terrible fender bender, and it says, "We designed every Volvo to look like this." So they really leaned into that safety message. They highlight their safety awards, their high safety ratings. They also target families in their ads. So they've really built this brand around safety. And that means they still have this reputation as one of the safest cars on the market, even though they didn't even make the top rankings this year from the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, which they do like an annual ranking on cars. So they're no longer one of those leaders in safety that they used to be, but they're still using that in their ads and riding that brand identity. That's it for this episode of The Marketing Architects. We'd like to thank Ayana Klaphocky for producing the show and Taylor De Los Reyes for editing. You can connect with us on LinkedIn, and if you find the show valuable, please leave us a rating and review. And if you'd like to hear more from us, subscribe to our weekly email newsletter. It's built for marketers seeking research-first analysis of the latest trends. You can go to marketingarchitects.com/newsletter to subscribe. Now go forth and build great marketing. Hey, what is advertising? Really? It's not a real question.
That's the next podcast.
Tune in next week.